welcome. Thank you all very much for coming. Just one little tip. The screens, as you can see, are exceptionally small, and with running at 16, I've got really small resolution up here. So there's room in the front. You might want to come a little closer. There's lots of room in the front over here. If you want to come closer, you might be able to see the code a little bit easier when we get that far. So we're going to talk about Angular 2 forms. My name's Deborah Kurata. I'm an independent consultant, developer, and mentor here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I do a lot of web stuff, Angular, and I also do .NET stuff. So I've done like web API kinds of things and WPF and that kind of stuff. I'm also a Pluralsight author. How many of you have heard of Pluralsight? Okay, if you don't have a Pluralsight subscription, the conference is very kindly giving us all a free month subscription to Pluralsight. So if you don't have a subscription, you might want to try it out. I've got several Angular courses out there, a couple of C# courses, and some Visual Studio courses, including a peek at Visual Studio 2015. So enough about me. How about all of you? I have 3 categories, and I'm asking that you could rate yourself on your Angular. How many believe that they're kind of fitting in the sort of new to Angular, just kind of starting out? How many are in that category? Okay, how about the intermediate category? Been doing it, and okay, how about more doing it for a while, more kind of advanced kind of people, a couple, okay. And tangential question, how many of you have tried Angular 2? A couple of people, okay. One of the biggest problems with trying Angular 2 right now is that you find a sample app, you download the sample app, and then you go download Angular, and the sample app and Angular don't match. So what I did with mine is something that we're not really supposed to do. I put all of Angular, the version of Angular that works with my demo, in the GitHub. So don't download the GitHub right now because it's really big, because it has all of Angular in it, all of the pieces that are needed to actually run the demo. Because the only way that I got it to work was to download the sample, download Angular, and call the folks at Google saying, I need help getting this to work, and that doesn't scale very well. So hopefully you'll have better luck, because all of the actual code that matches the API that I'm using is here. And we're going to continue to have this problem up through the point that Angular 2 is slowing down in the development. And as developers, we all know that might be a little bit of time yet. But all the session materials, the slides, and all of the sample code are up on my GitHub. Okay, so getting started. Angular 2 forms, they're projecting that we will have 3 different ways to build our forms with Angular 2. The first way they're calling template-driven, and that's very similar to how we're doing it with Angular 1x right now. The template, of course, is referring to our HTML template that we're building, and it is basically building the form with HTML and adding the controls with HTML, and then in our controller code, actually writing our logic that makes the form work. So the template-driven is very similar to how we do it now. Now, they're also doing something that was originally called imperative-driven, but now I'm seeing it called model-driven, whereby we would build the form in our JavaScript code. So instead of building the form in our HTML, we're going to be building it with JavaScript code. We're going to look at what that looks like and what the benefits are of that in just a little while. The other choice that we're going to have that will probably not be out with Angular 2, but will be out shortly thereafter, might even end up being a community kind of project, is to have data-driven forms. If any of you are from the old Microsoft days, most of you look way too young, but if any of you are from the old Microsoft days, we had something called Data Dude. Does anybody remember that at all? If anybody does, they don't want to admit it. Okay, we got a couple of people. Basically, what that was is a way to point your code at some kind of data source, you know, your domain model, basically, and give it some attributes for what you might want your labels called, and voila, it would build all of the form for you. And that's what this data-driven approach is going to do as well, so that we won't have to write any HTML. The code will simply build the form for us. Okay, again, that's not expected to come out in Angular 2, in the first cut of Angular 2, but it's something that they've been talking about. Because of that, I am not going to be showing any sample code for what that will look like because it's not that far along. Someone on the internet did lay out what that might look like, and so you can look up data-driven Angular 2 and see what that person expected it to look like. But you know, who knows what it will eventually look like. But let's dive into template-driven forms. Again, this is the one that's similar to 1.x. Now I'm going to be showing all of this code with TypeScript, so you'll see all of the same kind of code like you saw yesterday, where we're going to have our TypeScript class. So instead of our controller function, our checkout controller would instead be a class with Angular 2. And instead of our VM dot whatever, our VM dot model, VM dot countries, where we would use the controller as syntax inside the function, here we would just identify the properties. So we've got a property called model and a property called countries. Now our model is defined by creating a new instance of our checkout model. What does that look like? We'll see that on the next slide. And then here is just our controller methods. Again, very similar to how we do it in 1.x, but it doesn't have to say vm.onSubmit. It's just onSubmit, and it doesn't require the function keyword. You can just write the function right in there. So again, it's very similar conceptually to what we're doing today. The model, this is that checkout model. Remember, we have model equal new checkout model. So this is what the checkout model might look like. So using TypeScript, even now with 1.x, we can actually do domain objects with Angular 1x. With Angular 2, we'll be able to do them as well. And we can define a class with first name, middle name, last name, and so on. And we can strongly type them using TypeScript's strong typing. So that's our TypeScript class, our strongly typed properties. Now what about our view? How different will that look between 1.x and 2.0? Well, this is what it would look like in 2.0. First of all, as you saw yesterday, the rounded parens there are the definition for event binding. So we're event binding on the ng submit and telling it to call the onSubmit method when you click the button. Okay, so that's not that different than what we're doing now. The hash symbol in Angular 2 is referring to a local variable. So in 1x, we would have something like ng-model equals and have some variable. Instead, now we can just hashtag it, and then we can also give it a default value. Now, you may have heard someone on the Angular team say, especially if you watched any of the videos from NG Europe, that we will no longer have two-way binding. Technically, we no longer have two-way binding, but we have two-way binding. What we have is, in this example, the square brackets are identifying that we have property binding. So that's the one-way binding from our model to our view. So we have the ability to get the first name field from our model and put it into that as a default value. Okay? The rounded parens, the rounded brackets, whatever, what did I say? The outside square brackets are the property binding. The rounded parens ones are the event binding. So you've got the square braces, which are the property binding. The rounded braces, also known as parentheses, are the event binding. And the event binding is what is taking the user's typed values, because they're executing events, key down or whatever. That is what's giving us back the value. So even though under the covers, technically the code from the Angular team's point of view is not the two-way binding of old, we are getting the same result as with two-way binding. But it's really property binding one way and event binding the other way. Is that making sense? So I heard someone on the Angular team refer to this as the square brace, round brace syntax. So hopefully we'll come up with a shorter way to refer to that. Just SR maybe for square round. But anyway, so that is our two-way binding that we're going to be having. But again, it doesn't look that much different than what we had before. And then we also have direct property binding. So in this case, I'm binding disabled, the disabled property of that button, and I'm binding it to not f.form. Where's that f coming from? That was my private variable that I defined with that hash f earlier. Okay, so that's the private variable. All right, we saw yesterday that ng repeat is being replaced with ng4. So there we have our two-way binding again, where we're binding to the model.country. Okay, and there's our star ng4. When the team first came up with this syntax, they used a bang symbol, and everybody was reading it as not ng4. So luckily they changed it to a star, but if you look at really old examples, you might see the bang syntax there. And that hash C, of course, is our local variable, and we've got our property binding. And guess what else we still have? We still have our double curly brace syntax. So that isn't going away. We still can use our one-way binding, because here we're simply binding our drop-down list. Okay, so let's take a look at some code. So here I have Visual Studio Code open, and I have, I'm using TypeScript here, so I'm importing all of the stuff that I need, and in this particular version of Angular that I have, all this stuff is all just in Angular 2, Angular 2. Some of the other examples, you'll see that the Angular 2 form stuff is in a different library, but the one that I have, they're all in here. And so here's our model, our checkout model with our first name and so on. This is a component that handles our errors. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at that. Here is our main component, which is TemplateDriven Forms. And here's our checkout form with the onSubmit. And this is the code that we just saw on the slides, that one, and the country. And at the very bottom of this is our controller. And again, we saw something that looked very much like that in the slides. So we can go ahead and run this with any luck. There it is. Okay, so you notice that I don't have, Twitter Bootstrap in here or styling because I wanted to just keep us focused on Angular 2 forms. And of course, we all want to jump right to Angular 2 because it does look so much better, right? Just kidding. All right, so validation, though, is working. Look at that. So I've got validation. My drop-down list works. I've got validation on there and on the email. And you can see that when it's invalid, my submit button is canceled. That's because of that if not f.form.isValid, then disable the button. Whoops. So let's fill this out. So I can put in an A and an A and an A and an A and 12 and an email address here. And now my submit button is active. So if I push the F12 here and then click submit, I can see that it is submitting those values. So pretty exciting demo, isn't it? So I think it's actually thrilling that we actually have some Angular 2 forms working. Woohoo! So that's that. All right, so looking back at the code just for a second, again, what we saw is that we had this template-driven forms tag, and if we look at the index.html, that's what we have here. So that's what's pulling it into our HTML, our entire template here. In a real app, we would, of course, this would be a template URL instead, and we would have all of our template code in a separate HTML file. But for the demo, it makes it easier to put it right in here. Okay, so that's that. There are never enough ports on these things. Okay. So that's what template-based forms look like. What about this other one? What about the imperative, or now frequently called model-driven? How are we going to build our form with some code? What I did is I took that same controller class and I changed it to use the new model-driven syntax. So you'll see that we still have our TypeScript class here, but instead of having our model there, we're defining a variable that we're calling our form model. So you can think of Angular 2 template-driven forms as us as developers building our controller code saying, okay, form, here is our domain model. Do with it what you would like. On the other hand, our model-driven approach is we're not giving them the whole domain model. We're instead giving them a definition of the form, basically a form model, and saying, you can display this. Okay? In the form model, then, we are defining that using something called Form Builder. And Form Builder is a new Angular 2 service that we can use in our code. So we're injecting that service in here. We're abbreviating it FB and defining it to be of type Form Builder. And then that's where we're actually building our form and defining our model. So this .form model equals, so FB.group. We're calling the group method off of the form builder to define a group of controls. And for each control, we're saying, okay, we've got a first name. That first element in the array there is a default value if we want one. And the second element there is any validation. And if you have more than one set of validators that have to execute, you can look at the credit card example. And we've got something called validators.compose, and we could add multiple validators there. In this example, the credit card validator would be a custom validation method that we would have. Okay? And again, we still have our controller methods in here, so that part isn't changed. What is the group method? The group method here, the fb.group, is allowing us to define a set of controls. So instead of defining separate controls and then adding them individually to the form, we can just define a form group where we're identifying all the controls that we want. I'm sorry? If you just wanted to create one control, there is also a control that you can create a new control. Yes? Yeah? Validators would be something that you would pull in an import. So the validators.required is a built-in one, And the credit card validator would be a custom one that you would build as a custom function. Or, yeah, a custom function. Okay, so the question is, when you're doing your validators, where are you importing it from? I have no idea. It was supposed to have been a validator class. I actually tried to make this example work. This entire example is posted up with Angular 2, but if you pull it down and try to run it with the current Angular 2 code, I was not able to make it go. I couldn't find where it was, and I felt bad enough using all the team's time to get the first example to work, so I don't know where it is at this point, and it's quite possible it might not be wherever it is when it's done. How's that for a great answer? I love talking about alpha code. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I only heard part of that, but I don't have a whole lot of time for questions, so I'm just going to cut the real short. The answer is, as of right now, there isn't a facility to put labels in here. If you're doing the data-driven approach, the concept that they defined did have the ability to define labels and such. So whether we will see labels in here or not is a question. If you feel strongly about it, post it on the Angular site. And because I only have 3 minutes left, I'm going to keep going, and please feel free to grab me after. I would be happy to answer what questions that I can. Okay, so moving on. How is our view different then if we're going to use this model-driven approach? What we're going to do is we would still have the event binding for that submit button, but here we're going to have property binding on the form as a whole. So we're binding to something called ng form model, our form model. So then if you notice the input box, there is no binding there. Okay, because we're binding the form, so we don't have to bind any of the individual controls. All we're doing is control mapping. So if you go back a minute, we see that our control was named first name, country, credit card. So here we would have ng control first name. So all the UI has to do is identify which named field is associated with which HTML input element. Okay, so it dramatically simplifies what has to be in our view. We don't have required and min length and max length and all of those guys that we used to have in there. And in here we still have the property binding. Okay, so the key differences between the template-driven and the model-driven. The controller exposes the data model in the template-driven approach, just like we do now in 1.x. Model-driven, we're getting that form model, the model of what the controls on the form are supposed to look like. Binding and validation in the template-driven is in the view, just like it is now with 1.x. In model-driven, it's in the controller. Lastly, the view contains data bindings in the template-driven. In the model-driven, the view only contains the control mappings. Okay? So benefits to model-driven, the behavior is in the code, not the template. So the binding and validation are defined in the code. That means it's easier to reason against as you're reading through the code. You can see the business logic. You can add ifs around it. Depending upon the user, you could have different validation requirements. Depending on the context, is it an add or an edit, you could have different validation requirements because it's in your code. More readily unit tested because you don't have to compile that template in order to do your testing. And it allows for these future scenarios like the ability to do data-driven forms. Okay, so our takeaway points are, you can use the template-driven approach with 2.0, and it'll keep it very similar to how we're doing it with 1.x now. You can also, with 2.0, use the model-driven approach and build the forms in code. The data-driven or potentially other future approaches are then possible because of these changes for the model-driven kinds of forms. With that, here's the contact information with the GitHub. I want to thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.